Okay, back to Business 900. We're in to the text by Dixit and Nailbuff, Thinking Strategically, the Competitive Edge in Business, Politics, and Everyday Life. What I'm doing here is a series of lectures. I'm going to try to keep them a little bit shorter, but I want to cover a variety of topics in small units, where the author's text is actually pretty simple to read. I'm going to give you examples from the field of game theory to sort of survey this area of business strategy. The idea here is that what motivates much of this work is a question that often is asked, but we don't have easy answers available. See, different firms often face the same forces in an industry. Say the same 5 forces are present in the smartphone marketplace. They're present to Apple, they're present to Samsung, they're present to BlackBerry, and so on. Now, why would it be that that same firm, that those different firms that face the 5 different forces that we get from Porter, why are they all performing differently? And what you want to do is utilize a very straightforward, systematic way to try to cut through a lot of the nitty-gritty details. And here we're focusing on some of the essential elements of sort of foundational concepts of strategic thinking. So notice how we worked in the course. We kind of opened with very broad strategic ideas, then we dove into some details. Lawless Treat People Right gets at the issue of unleashing that virtuous spiral in an organization that it would be successful. Now we're sort of backing up to a more, call it a meta level of thought, where we're again in the broad view and looking at the firm's strategy. And then what will happen next at the end of the 8-week course, we'll dive back in again in a much more narrow area, dealing with the problem of incentives, which it turns out has been the subject of a great deal of experimental economics. In fact, Avinash Dixit, one of the authors of the Thinking Strategically book, is heavily involved in research in this area. So let's get going with just this introduction. Here I quote Andy Grove, who co-founded Intel, who said only the paranoid survive. So game theory, what's it all about, right? Thinking strategically is based upon a field of mathematics and economics, which recognizes that rational behavior can actually be interactive or interdependent. The bad news is knowing this field won't guarantee that you win, but the good news is you get a framework for thinking. We play games all the time, right? There are group projects. Flat tire games are when a student has arrived from spring break late, and they say, we had a flat tire. And we got what you can do is check that by basically cross-referencing one student's story against another's. This is called a coordination game. You have mean professors, which highlight what are known as commitment games. Grading curves, tennis and baseball, of course, are mixed strategy games. Poker is a credibility game. Traffic and dating. See, games are all around us in real life. And what we want to do is examine games that businesses play, also dealing with market entry, say drug testing methodologies, counterterrorism, of course, is also in the mix. Corporate takeovers, fishing, and fisheries and how those are managed is an issue. Stock options, right? Patent races, OPEC. Why study this field? Recruiters say do it, right? Game theory is a way of helping you understand a business situation. What's really key is, right, it's a way of helping us sort of stand in the shoes of the other, of especially your competitor. And it also is used heavily in the study of industrial organization to explain why, in essence, oligopolies tend to be unprofitable. We get a set of tools in place, in a sense, so that we can act better, utilize a framework for formulating good judgments better, and also devise frameworks that enable us to see the right things so that we are measuring the right things and managing them. I just realized that for some reason my slides are broken here. So I'm actually going to, no, I'll skip that one. Okay. This one should have been turned off too. I'm borrowing a little bit from basically a revised presentation I use in a game theory course. Right. So first disclaimer of note is here you have Calvin watching TV and Mom throws him out the door. He's complaining though, it's too hot and bright, too humid, too many bugs are out here and all that. And he finally comes to the real notion that it's too real. So theory, in this sense, as Dixit and Nailbuff are presenting it to us, is an applied science, the applied science of business. So it's giving you a way of organizing your thinking. The second disclaimer, though, is that there's a little bit of mathematics. Here you have Hagar the Horrible, and he's upset because the preacher has mentioned that you have to multiply. Well, there's just a little bit of math, and most of it is actually pretty coherent in this text. Okay, so it's not too overwhelming. Let's identify why this thinking strategically approach differs, right, from typical decision theory. In decision theory, we hold the notion that you're self-interested and that you're selfish, that you, not greedy, let's say, but that you have a focus on trying to improve oneself, to build oneself. The game theory approach is that everyone else is also. I quote George Carlin here for humorous effect. He says, if it's true that we're here to help others, then what are the others here for? Golden rule in game theory, you should never assume that your opponent's behavior is fixed. You have to be able to predict their reactions to your behavior. That's a topic that Nailbuff and Dixit jump on quite quickly in the text. Imagine this difference between decision theory and game theory. In this particular case, 10 people go to a restaurant. They hang out there, they eat, they need to pay for their meal. If each person pays for their own meal, it's just simply a decision problem. But if you all go and you say, hey, let's split up the bill, now you know that it is game. In the restaurant decision-making process, some person is looking at their menu. The waiter comes and says, I would recommend the blue cheese for $10 more. The individual who's making the decision thinks we're splitting our check, so that extra $10 is only $1 for me. The check splitting changes the incentives in that decision-making scenario. So incentives are crucial. Do bicycle helmets cause less injuries? Turns out, no. Should airplanes require children to be in their own seats? Turns out, no. Why shut down a plant operating at capacity? Well, might have to do that, especially if the losses from shutdown are less than the losses from operating. Could you make a new product and then say, okay, let's put it out there, and should you cannibalize your own sales? Turns out it might make sense to do that. Some counterintuitive stuff is going on here. Why offer price guarantees to consumers? It turns out to be not so good for consumers and amazingly good for businesses. Look at decision theory once more. Imagine that you had 3 options. One pays you 50, one pays you 40, one pays you 20. Pick an option. Just some free money. That's just a simple decision. Imagine that we change that scenario a little bit, though, and we say, now pick an option 1, 2, or 3, which is $50 or $60, right? $40 or $80, or $20 or $90. That perhaps there's some uncertainty. Maybe there's 2 doors or 2 boxes, and you have to select one of the 2. Or maybe you flip a coin for one of the 2 options. This is a little bit more complicated. Let's look at an example of an application to the competitive landscape to see how game theory would work. You have toy stores, you have department stores. You have the Toys R Us situation where basically about 50% markups exist in the toy and department stores. Then you have the general discounters. This would be, say, Walmart and Target. Now, they being discounters, run with about, on average, 9% markups. And keep in mind, right, one context here is that toys exhibit a high degree of product differentiation. It's tough to say we're going to specialize in a certain type of toy that we produce and sell. That'd be a niche marketing kind of approach, but it doesn't work well in these general discounters and toy and department stores. And then you have the specialized discounters, Toys R Us, in this competitive landscape. Nationally, they were about a 20% market share. And slowly coming in the 1980s, Costco, Pace, and Sam's Club and the other warehouse clubs began to come into play. And by 1989, about 200 items in the full set of toy categories are in much more intense competition. And this is causing a concern for Toys R Us. So Toys R Us does a little bit of market research concerning the future of the warehouse clubs. The manufacturers were estimating about 3 to 5% annual growth rates. Toys R Us was doing a pretty comprehensive study, but kept it proprietary to try to keep some of the data hidden. The manufacturers became aware of the Toys R Us study being done, but they were not really sure about the results. Toys R Us actually expected the warehouse clubs to grow pretty fast, faster than the growth rates estimated by the manufacturers. So Toys R Us decides, let's issue a statement to the toy makers. And they say, you may not sell to the warehouse clubs without losing Toys R Us as a customer. Toys R Us basically has a $5 billion market. Choose that one, or the warehouse clubs, running at the time at around a $500 million market. So what would you do? Maybe there should be a brokering of a special cooperative agreement among the toy manufacturers so that they could monitor any complaints about this system of selling through the value chain. And if any complaints come up, we'll have a clearinghouse to make sure that that everybody participating in the value chain is getting some part of the value of the created value. You also might use consumer expectations, and that might be a way to alter the payoffs that operate within the value chain. So you set up an annual industry convention, you do product launches, you of course face safety advisories and recalls. That's helping you make sure that you've got consumer input and experience in the process, and you generate compatibility across the product lines. The manufacturers came to Toys R Us saying, that makes sense, we'll do it. Now the warehouse club toy sales actually went down. The pre-agreement growth was running at around 51% per year, and that's a pretty fast category of growth considering the overall growth of clubs was running around 10% per year. Now let's throw our caveat into place. It's true that you want to predict your opponent's reaction to your behaviors, and remember that it should not be thought of as fixed ever. But you need to be sure you understand who your opponents are, that you need to figure out everyone who might react to your business strategy. Maybe later I'll come back to how Toys R Us experienced the sort of fallout from the agreements that were in play. But in essence, what we're doing in the early part of the Dixit Nail Buff book is introducing games and understanding how to define them. You have decision makers, who are the players. You have the feasible actions that the decision makers can take. We call these the available strategies. And you have the payoffs, which are what we'll call the objectives. So you have to know the players, the strategies, and the payoffs. That's something common to all of the game examples that are presented throughout this book. And then the next thing you need to do is you understand the rules. You have to understand the time frame for the decisions, the nature of the conflict that is in play, and what kind of interactions occur. Also, information is crucial at the simple sort of phase of understanding game theory and thinking strategically. You assume that everyone has about the same amount of information. Information might not be available. You saw that aspect, for instance, of the Toys R Us market research study, which actually wound up being far more accurate about the warehouse club growth, but they had to kind of keep that information to themselves in order to be able to come forward and talk about. We're the better customer, say, for the toy makers because of our large market share. It turns out that large market share was growing very slowly, under 3-4% per year, compared to a much more viable and faster growing market at the warehouse clubs. But the toy makers didn't know it. They had bad data. So that was an information asymmetry situation. So that's an intro lecture. I'm going to, as I said, try to keep these approximately 15 to 20 minutes at the most. So I'm going to take this first one and put it up into Blackboard.